the untold story of George R.R. Martin and the real inspirations behind Game of Thrones. Before the Red Wedding shocked the world, before the Iron Throne became the most coveted seat in television history, there was a boy who grew up in a quiet town, surrounded not by castles and dragons, but by steel mills and shipyards. A boy who kept pet turtles in a toy castle and imagined them plotting against each other for power. A boy who would one day change the fantasy genre forever. George R.R. Martin did not create Game of Thrones from thin air. No, his world was forged in the fires of real history, brutal betrayals, and tragic war stories more savage than anything Hollywood could dream up. But what exactly inspired Westeros? Where did he find the darkness behind the Red Wedding, the horror of the Night King? And most importantly, will he ever finish the wines of Waiter? Stay with me as we dive into the untold story of George R.R. Martin, his inspirations, his struggles, and the real-life history that made Game of Thrones so unforgettable. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Dreamed of Other Worlds. George Raymond Richard Martin was born in 1948 in Bayonne, New Jersey, a blue-collar town where the sky was lined with ship masts, not castle spires. But inside his mind, there were always castles, always heroes, always battles. As a boy, he didn't just read stories, he created them. His first kingdom, a glass tank filled with turtles. They kept dying, one after the other, and young George imagined they were locked in a bloody struggle for power. Kings, assassins, betrayals. Sound familiar? He began writing monster stories and selling them for a few pennies to neighborhood kids. But it wasn't just fantasy that captured his heart, it was history. While other kids played baseball, George read about medieval wars, Roman emperors, and the brutality of real kings and queens. He saw that power was never simple. There were no perfect heroes, only rulers who would do anything to survive. Chapter 2. The bloody real history that built Westeros. They say truth is stranger than fiction, and for Game of Thrones, the truth is bloodier. Many of the most shocking moments from the series weren't created by Martin's imagination. They were stolen straight from history. Take the infamous Red Wedding, a betrayal so brutal, so unforgivable, that it left millions of fans in shock. But this wasn't fiction. Martin took inspiration from two real-life massacres. The Black Dinner of 1440 in Scotland, where a young noble was invited to a feast and murdered, and the Glencoe Massacre of 1692, where guests were killed by their own hosts. Or consider the Starks versus Lannisters. This wasn't just storytelling, it was a fantasy version of the real War of the Roses, where England was torn apart by the Yorks and the Lancasters, names eerily similar to the Starks and Lannisters. Even the wall that separates Westeros from the lands beyond was inspired by Hadrian's Wall, built by the Romans to keep out the wild northern tribes. The lesson: nothing in Westeros is pure fantasy. Martin simply took the darkest moments of human history and gave them dragons. Chapter 3. Hollywood Rejection and the book that changed everything. Before he ruled the 7 kingdoms of fantasy, George R.R. Martin struggled in Hollywood. He worked on TV shows like The Twilight Zone and Beauty and the Beast, but his scripts were too big, too ambitious. One producer rejected his work, saying, "This is amazing, but we can't afford that many horses." Imagine trying to write Game of Thrones when a battle scene was limited by a horse budget. Frustrated, Martin left Hollywood and returned to writing novels. And in 1991, he started working on a book he never expected to become a global sensation, A Game of Thrones. Chapter 4. How HBO made Game of Thrones possible. For years, A Song of Ice and Fire was considered unfilmable, too vast, too complex, too brutal. No studio was willing to risk it until HBO came along. In 2007, HBO producers David Benioff and D.B. Weiss approached Martin, telling him they wanted to adapt Game of Thrones. Martin asked them one question: who is Jon Snow's mother? When they answered correctly, He knew they understood the depth of his story. HBO gave them the biggest budget ever for a TV pilot, allowing them to create the world of Westeros in unprecedented detail. But even then, the first pilot was a disaster. It had to be reshot. Many doubted the show would survive. But once it aired in 2011, Game of Thrones exploded into a global phenomenon. Chapter 5. Will he ever finish the Wines of Winter? Fans have been waiting over a decade for the Wines of Winter. Martin says he's still working, but with HBO creating spin-offs and fans growing impatient, the question remains, will he finish it? Martin himself fears he might not, just like J.R.R. Tolkien, who left the Silmarillion unfinished. But one thing is certain, no matter how it ends, Game of Thrones has already become legendary. Chapter 6. The criticisms of Game of Thrones, controversial themes, incest, and backlash. As much as Game of Thrones became a global sensation, it was never without controversy. Critics and fans alike debated its dark themes, brutal violence, and controversial portrayals of relationships. One of the most talked about aspects of the series was incest, from Jaime and Cersei Lannister's forbidden relationship to Daenerys and Jon Snow's shocking revelation. Game of Thrones openly explored family ties that crossed moral lines. But why did Martin include incest so heavily in his books? The answer, once again, lies in real history. Medieval dynasties often married within their own bloodlines to preserve power and lineage. The Targaryens, much like the real-life Habsburgs of Spain and Austria, believed their bloodline was superior, leading to generations of inbreeding, and in some cases, madness. But incest wasn't the only controversial topic in Game of Thrones. The series faced backlash for its graphic sexual violence, excessive nudity, and treatment of female characters. Many fans praised the show for its gritty realism, but others argued that it glorified brutality in ways that weren't necessary for storytelling. And of course, there was the ending. The final season of Game of Thrones sparked one of the biggest fan backlashes in TV history. Critics called it rushed, unsatisfying, and unfaithful to the deep, intricate storytelling Martin had built over decades. So, what did Martin himself think? In interviews, he admitted he had little control over how HBO ended the series. And as fans waited for the Wines of Winter, Martin hinted that his version of the ending would be very different, from a child with pet turtles to the creator of a fantasy empire. George R.R. Martin's journey proves one thing: stories have power, and the best ones, they never truly end. But now, it's your turn. Will Martin finish the Wines of Winter? What's your favorite Game of Thrones moment? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, share it with fellow GOT fans, and subscribe for more deep dives into legendary storytellers. And if you want more untold history behind Game of Thrones, check out this next video here.